Ma'am, you may begin.
Thank you so much, and I'll add my welcome to everyone for joining us for today's Connect and Explore webinar. The program today spotlights innovations in behavioral design to enhance active living and healthy eating. There will be an overview of NCCOR work on behavioral design, followed by two wonderful presentations, one on school design strategies to promote physical activity, and a second on cafeteria assessment for elementary schools. And then we will have a follow-up update on NCCOR behavioral design activities. The one-on-one that you see on today's program is a question and answer period. You will be able to provide your questions to speakers. I'll tell you more about that in just a minute. And at the end, we'll have just a couple of brief NCCOR announcements. So if you have a question for our speakers during the webinar, please write it in the chat box on the right of your screen. Or if you need technical assistance, please let us know using that same chat box. If you're having trouble logging into the webinar but can hear us on the phone, you can email us at NCCOR, NCCOR, at FHI360.org. That's NCCOR at FHI360.org, and we'll work with you to resolve the problem. And just one final but important technical note. If you're listening to the webinar using your computer speakers, please turn down or mute your computer microphone now. This will greatly reduce the potential for background noise, especially since there's so many of us on this call. And thank you so much for that. So, moving right ahead, if we will be live tweeting during the webinar. If you're on Twitter or other social media platforms, we encourage you to join the conversation using the hashtag ConnectExplore and following at NCCOR on Twitter and at NCCOR.org on Facebook. Today's speakers include Joel Kemmons, PhD, who is a senior scientist at the Division of Nutrition, Physical Activity, and Obesity at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, followed by Jerry Britton, PhD, Director of Research at HDR, and Kim Rawlings, PhD, Assistant Professor at the School of Architecture at the University of Notre Dame. So Joel, Jerry, and Kim, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. Just before we hear from our first speaker, Joel, we'd like to start off with a very brief poll. You can submit your answer directly on the screen and do select all the answers that apply. So the question is, what sector or sectors do you work in? I'll give you just a minute. Okay, so it looks like we have a lot of people working in government and a lot in academia and the nonprofit sectors. I'm sure there are some people who are working in several of those. So thank you so much for that. And I would now like to turn it over to Joel.
Thank you, Elaine. It's interesting. I think actually there's a reasonable area here for to bring in more people from the industry for a lot of these discussions, but it's good to be getting this discussion out as we start here. Also, it's interesting to see the attendee list. I still see it on the computer. Lots of good folks out there I know, so welcome. I'm glad you're dialed in here. So to begin with, and many of you on the phone, actually looking through your names, have sort of know this history, but I'll go through it briefly. About 3 years ago, NCCOR started to work through these concepts of behavioral economics, choice architecture, and other ideas around that, design and architecture ideas, and we're trying to figure out, what's a core area that we can really pin this in. So we use the term behavioral design as the sort of science practice of how environments influence our decisions and actions. and we began to explore and develop behavioral design as a field. Started that with conducting a few workshops, bringing people of very diverse disciplines and different sort of neurological abilities and psychological abilities, different neurotypes together to think through these ideas, so cross-disciplinary efforts, and then to disseminate findings and encourage more research, but also include more practice that was really followed and manipulated over time and developed in better practice, so a sort of practice-based evidence model, which is really critical here because these are very diverse areas that we need to try to capture how whole environments influence people. So we started this out, say 2015. We wanted to go straight into having a sort of large-scale meetings, bringing diverse stakeholders together. We found that difficult because the diversity was so wide. And it started out with basically a virtual think tanks on the phone and started to explore these ideas to sort of narrow it down and say, what are the core questions that we can actually effectively answer? And from there, we had an in-person meeting, brought groups from, again, various different disciplines together, and we published a white paper out of that called Health, Behavioral Design, and the Built Environment. I encourage everyone to take a look at that on the web. It's a good sort of intro into how this discussion has gone, how we tried to marry these various disciplines, both academic, industrial, and practical together to come up with some core ideas about moving these ideas forward. And we presented that work in a similar presentation as you're hearing today at the EDRA conference in 2017. We didn't do it this year. We have to do it again next year. That's a very good conference. I sort of consider EDRA the home of this type of work. It's sort of where we put the, say it's the academic root of behavioral design. And then finally, we have recently taken the white paper and we rewrote it and published it as a book chapter in an emerging theory for dietary behavioral change book. And that's just come out. It's now available on Amazon, so I encourage everyone to take a look.
Thank you so much. And I'll just point out that the white paper, there's a link to it and under web links on your screen. As a reminder, if you have a question for Joel or any of our other speakers, please use the chat box on the right of your screen. We'll address it during the Q&A segment this afternoon. And with that, Jerry, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Elaine, and hello, everyone. I'm going to spend the next few minutes talking about behavioral design in promotion of movement or physical activity, specifically in the context of school environments or learning environments. Within the realm of kind of the ecology of health, it's pretty well acknowledged now that the built environment plays a role, that the built environment affords opportunities for behavioral change and experiential change, that those can lead to social and cultural change, and ultimately to health outcomes. And what I'm going to talk about in a few minutes is just a pilot study where we were able to test some of these concepts. So, you know, what are the possibilities if we're able to structure the environment so that it's safe for kids to be running and riding bikes outside and getting to school on their own? What if we put elements in the environment that are really irresistible to run up and jump off? Even in schools, what if we kind of do unexpected things like put climbing construction on the walls and actually allow kids to climb the walls in school? So we're seeing these days, and I mean, I'd like to report as I'm in an industry, and I think somebody asked what HDR stands for. So HDR stands for Henningsen, Durham, and Reynolds, and those were three founders of HDR. We were founded 101 years ago. They were three engineers. We are now a global architectural and engineering firm. We happen to be based in Omaha, Nebraska, which is where they started, and they were really the first to bring electricity to much of Nebraska. So that's our history. In the field today, I think we are starting to see some shift in the design world where traditionally architects kind of worked with clients, worked with communities, worked with contractors to design and get buildings built. And typically public health and thinking about health even was not really part of that equation. We are trying to move toward, and I'd like to say that we're making a lot of progress, especially in the last few years, toward bringing health to be a central theme in design, to really conceive design of the built environment as a wealth of potential interventions in health behaviors and health outcomes. So what we're really trying to move toward is a more inclusive process that brings health into a central role. At HDR, the way that we are incorporating this into the sort of traditional, and it's usually expressed in a very linear way, planning a building or a community or a set of buildings, actually designing it, then constructing it, and then people move in and it's there for a while. We're really trying to get upstream from that process in terms of thinking about all of the planning that needs to and that can happen to make sure that we're including all of the necessary goals of design, that we're assessing the evidence that exists in terms of how design can impact people and impact human outcomes, to figure out really what the goals are, what we might operationalize and measure with that building process to both confirm that what we think we're doing really happens and to also learn from that so that we can design better going forward. And that, you know, when we're able to really put all of that planning, which for those of you who come from a public health background, it's really intervention evaluation planning, right? Conceiving a building as an intervention, that we are really trying and making progress to do that measurement before the intervention happens as well as after. When we can, we'll try to incorporate some control or comparison groups that will sort of, you know, be along the same time path. So a lot of progress being made. I'd like to talk about now just a couple of schools that we were able to measure. And this is a pilot-sized study in 2 states, some school environments in rural Virginia and rural New York State. The team that worked on this included both architecture and designers as well as public health researchers. And we came together and developed a set of evidence and theory-based school design guidelines. And those were published in 2015, actually, in PLOS One, the references there. So looking at the current literature, we honed in on school siting and connection to the community, some indication that denser areas may be better in terms of promoted active commuting, you know, having routes that kids can actually walk or bike to school. Building massing and programming, more of an architectural function, not a whole lot of evidence out there, but we proposed some ideas in terms of scaling and allowing sort of spaces that are scaled to fit children and to help promote their comfort and movement, including fitness-specific facilities, active classrooms that allow space for movement, that have areas dedicated to different types of activities in hopes of getting kids and teachers to move around. Outdoor learning area. We know that kids tend to be more active outdoors, and so allowing them to learn outdoors, facilitating that. Active play and leisure areas. Navigation areas, so putting stairs and, you know, making them beautiful and putting them in a central area, not just out in the corners of the building. Some motivational signage and kind of wayfinding that helps people find their way confidently and maybe has those irresistible elements along the way that you might want to jump and touch. Dynamic furniture, there is some evidence around that includes both the furniture that moves with you as well as the stand-biased or sit-stand types of furniture. And then we also found there was just a little bit of emerging evidence around some new technologies like using virtual reality, kids kind of participating in an activity program that was virtually based so they could do normal activities but kind of within within this virtual realm be doing really extraordinary kinds of things. So some of that was kind of starting to come to light too. So the school was really designed around many of these concepts. You see the open stair, the active play area which allows other kids to look in and see what's going on, the large kind of open classroom, movable furniture, little nooks for different activities, reading, outdoor class, some signage that was really fun and also encouraging of activity. So we were able with these schools to do a pre-post natural experiment design. We looked at, there were two different basic school conditions, kind of an old traditional school environment, and that did not change over time. And then this new school that was introduced in Virginia, designed based on those guidelines. We had some control variables in there, gender and race ethnicity, and then our outcomes were accelerometer measures. So they included time per day in sedentary behavior, breaks in sedentary behavior, time in light physical activity, and time in moderate to vigorous physical activity. So the research design was really a pre-post design with a comparison group, and then we also had an age-matched comparison, independent samples comparison, where we measured a group of third graders in the old school and then a group of third graders in the new school. So we did that component just to kind of take out the maturation element. The results, for the most part, were what we expected. The results were quite significant despite our relatively small sample size. And we, as expected, did see reduction in daily sedentary behavior, reduced length of sedentary bouts, more breaks from sedentary behavior, and more light physical activity. Contrary to what we expected, we saw a decrease in moderate to vigorous physical activity. And that was in our pre-post within subject longitudinally measured group. In our age-matched group, we got pretty much exactly the same results. So what we expected in terms of sedentary behavior, light physical activity, the opposite of what we expected in terms of moderate to vigorous physical activity. So then, looking back, at the pre and post school environments, we realized that, and this is now just a hypothesis, maybe for somebody's next study, which I really hope that someone will pick up and find funding and continue some of this work. On the left here, and I know these images aren't the greatest, but on the left is the old school, very traditional old single school building that actually had trailers. So you can see kind of the main building is that white bar, and then below that there are some separate structures that are trailers. And the trailer is where the third grade students were, and they were very, very close to the playground area and could get to that almost immediately. In the other school, the distance was about 3 times as far to get to the playground area. And so we think because they had to walk in the school to get to that area, that may have had some negative impact on the moderate to vigorous physical activity. So that's the question that is left open by this research. We think that it was very successful in terms of impacting both sedentary and light physical activity, but more work to be done to really promote the moderate to vigorous. And probably, potential interventions might look at combinations of the environment, getting those places where vigorous physical activity is both promoted, is condoned, as well as kind of the opportunity. So the promotion of it and the opportunity.
Thank you.
That's the end of my piece. Thank you, Elaine.
Thank you so much, Jerry. And there are questions coming in for you. And we will, after all of our presentations, turn to the questions. So just a reminder again, if you haven't had a chance to type in your question, please add it to the chat box located on the right. And with that, I will turn it over to Kim.
Great. Thank you, Elaine. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to discuss the development and testing of the cafeteria assessment for elementary schools, or CAFES for short. CAFES is an assessment tool that measures or quantifies physical attributes of 2nd to 5th grade cafeteria environments linked to selection and consumption of fruits and vegetables. It scores various categories of these attributes and suggests improvements, many of which are low and no cost and can be immediately implemented. Prior to the development of CAFES, many studies focused on older students and adults and how meal item pricing, choice or variety, and controlling portion size can affect eating behaviors. But in elementary schools with USDA-funded meals, which are the focus of CAFES, meals are paid for with prepaid cards or are free to low-income families, so pricing of individual items isn't a factor. Students may have few or no meal choices, especially in under-resourced schools, and portion sizes are often controlled, so changes related to portion size aren't relevant. CAFES development was grounded in 2 theories from behavioral economics and environmental psychology, the first being nudging, which is facilitating healthy choices without imposing restrictions on or coercing students. The second is this idea of affordances from environmental psychology, that describes a group of elements within an environment that present the opportunity for or allow a particular behavior like healthy eating to occur. And then CAFES also focuses on the physical or the built environment, as Jerry just mentioned. We know that availability and accessibility are among the strongest predictors of diet, but other physical factors affect eating behaviors as well, and across different scales of the built environment. So we can think about the room or interior design scale, ambient environment factors. You think about the furniture from dining tables and chairs to counters and food serving displays. We can think about the plate or container scale, so the size of a plate or a lunch tray, its color, and individual food item appearance and packaging. Prior to CAFES, few design guidelines existed to help designers create cafeterias that support healthy eating. I know Jerry and her colleagues have worked on some of these. So CAFES aims to holistically assess or score these physical factors at those 4 scales and recommend improvements or interventions based on these scores that can really help make some improvements now, not just with renovation or new construction. The CAFES research questions helped identify or addressing the questions, I should say, allowed us to identify the relevant items to include in CAFES for assessment, and then test the reliability and the predictive validity of the CAFES tool. And those results have recently been published in a BNC Public Health article listed on this slide. And a copy of the CAFES tool can be downloaded as part of the additional files here. Right now we're working on developing and validating some low and no cost interventions related to the CAFES scores. We're also working on wrapping up a mobile app that will automate data entry, scoring, and obtaining the list of suggestion interventions. So that will be available at the website listed here. And then after we complete that intervention testing, we will work on developing some evidence-based design guidelines for school and design practitioners. CAFES development was based on a sample of 50 low-income schools and 11 additional for the app testing that's ongoing now. There were more than 3,000 second, fourth, and fifth grade students, and at least 50% free and reduced priced meal or lunch eligibility at the school level. A subset of those schools participated in the predictive validity analysis, so we were able to examine whether the CAFE scores actually did predict fruit and vegetable consumption and selection. And then the overall procedures thus far included the CAFE's development, which is complete, so everything from a lit review and expert panel to pilot testing and the reliability and validity analysis. We completed a preliminary intervention suggestion development based on a lit review. We're wrapping up the mobile app development and testing now, and then we'll start the intervention testing and design guideline development. The CAFE's analysis or development really focused on identifying the most critical items to include in the assessment tool and then how to score the items. So they're currently scored with a 0 or a 1 and some to calculate percentages out of 100% across those scales. The reliability measures examined whether the CAFE's items actually captured the concepts we were interested in, if multiple people assess the cafeteria, did they get the same results, and if the different scales that I'll talk about, if they were in fact actually different. And then for the predictive validity assessment, we used multi-level modeling, so students within schools to examine whether CAFE scores predicted fruit and vegetable selection and consumption. And this was done using lunch tray photography data. So software developed by one of our colleagues using the USDA meal database analyzed photos taken before and after eating to determine amounts of food consumed, or served and consumed. The mobile app testing will also assess reliability, and then the intervention testing will use a pre-post or before and after study design. The CAFE's development data included student gender, grade level, free and reduced price meal eligibility, ethnicity, age, and body mass index. And we also looked at both servings and consumption, so we were interested in whether or not the food on the tray was actually consumed. And then at the school level, we examined the CAFE scores, the student population or school size, the overall percentage of free and reduced price meal eligibility, minority student population, and whether the school was in a rural, urban, or suburban location. This table lists the types of CAFE's questions required to complete the assessment. The assessment requires interviews with the principal or vice principal, the food service manager or kitchen manager, observations of the preparation, serving, and eating areas in the cafeteria, and some photographs. It takes about 45 to 90 minutes, excluding the time for scoring and identifying the intervention suggestions. The app automates the entire process. And so CAFE scores can total 198 points based on questions categorized across these 4 scales and some subscales or subcategories. So at the room level, or the first row, the items can be categorized into 6 subscales. So the ambient environment looks at temperature, odor, crowding, ceiling height, lighting, and so on. Appearance looks at overall condition, attractiveness, and maintenance. Different window characteristics, layout and visibility, the presence or absence of healthy signage, and then items focused specifically on the kitchen and serving area, maintenance, attractiveness, and so on. At the table display scale, items focused on the eating area, furniture specifically, and then availability of various food and beverage items, as well as display layout and presentation, serving method, and variety of different food and beverage items. At the plate scale, we looked at serving tray area, color choice, and the material, as well as utensil availability. And then at the food scale, thinking about how often items were reheated versus prepared from scratch, the number of fruits and vegetables available per meal, whether or not items were breaded or fried, the percentage of fruits and vegetables that were raw, and whether or not fresh fruit was whole or sliced. The CAFE's questions are all scored with a 0 or a 1 and then totaled based on their relevant categories. So for example, on this screen, the items labeled F1 to F6 in the first column are part of the ambient environment questions. So each item is scored with a 0 or a 1 from the paper assessment. The coding instructions are found there. And then the spreadsheet automatically adds up all of the data entry, and you see this screen here with the resulting scores in the column labeled school. The other columns there show the average scores from the 50 schools that participated in development just for comparison. So the mobile app creates a similar score sheet, but also the list of resulting intervention suggestions as well. This table shows just the average scores from the 50 participating schools. So schools scored highest at the room scale, which is encouraging since it can often be expensive to address factors at that level. They scored lowest at the table display scale that includes food availability, but also many items that can be addressed via some of the low and no cost improvements. In the final column, we were aiming for a score of at least 0.7 for all of the categories, and we were able to achieve that for all but 3, most likely due to low variability in the sample of schools that we looked at. So we did keep those categories in the final version of cafes. The inter-rater reliability, the percent agreement among researchers who assessed the same cafeteria was at or above 90%. Cafe scores were significantly associated with the percentage of fruit and vegetables consumed from a served meal. So a 1 percentage point increase in cafes was associated with about a 1% increase in fruit and vegetables consumed. So that was about a 1.6 gram serving on average, and it takes 80 grams to make one serving approximately. And then the rest of the associated increases are listed there, ranging from 0.24 at the plate scale to 1.3 at the table scale. This slide illustrates some of the intervention suggestions that result from the score. So every item that gets a 0 receives an intervention suggestion here, categorized by the relevant scales and subcategories. So the first example in the ambient environment suggests playing soft music and encouraging students to be quiet enough so that they can hear it, includes students in selecting music. And each intervention is accompanied by $1, $2, or $3 signs, or sometimes a combination, and that's a relative cost estimate. So you could sort the interventions from the lowest to the highest cost if you were looking for the low and no cost suggestions, or if you were going to renovate or construct a new cafeteria, you could look at some of the higher cost items to implement from the beginning. Other examples at the window scale, for example, or category include planting trees or other greenery within the view of the cafeteria windows. A $3 sign example would be to install windows in a cafeteria that didn't have them, for example. The last intervention example on that page talks about layout and visibility, so arranging the cafeteria and serving areas such that permanent obstructions support rather than interfere with student circulation. At the other 3 cafe scales, looking at creating and displaying signage for creatively named, individually labeled healthy meal options. And then at the plate scale, offering students multiple tray colors and permitting choice, which is a lower cost suggestion. And then finally, at the food scale, an example looking at allowing students to select more than one fruit or vegetable per meal as a suggestion. So CAFE's focuses on a comprehensive assessment of physical factors, many of which can be addressed now or with the renovation or construction of a cafeteria. It suggests low and no cost interventions, many that can be immediately implemented after completing cafes. But cafes also assesses factors beyond policy, economic, and sociocultural factors. The limitations include that the sample was cross-sectional, so the generalizability of the results to other schools and settings is uncertain. Certain moderators were excluded from the analysis of cafes, so food quality, for example. If food doesn't taste great to students or is at a poor temperature, it might interfere with the effectiveness of the suggested interventions. And then an in-depth kitchen analysis was excluded and beyond the scope of our observations, so we didn't look at the available appliances, for example. We're hoping to get some of that information with the intervention testing, since that would obviously inform design guidelines. Currently, as I mentioned, we're wrapping up the development of the mobile application. So the website listed here will have instructions on how to download it to Android or Apple devices. And that really automates the data entry, scoring, and intervention output process. So it makes the process a lot faster, and it allows you to email yourself scores and also share with us if you were participating in a research study, for example. Then we will start on the intervention testing and continue with evidence-based design guideline development. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kim. And there are a number of questions that have come in. Again, a reminder, if you haven't had a chance to add a question that you would like to see discussed, just type it in the chat box on the right. And we'll continue to track those questions as we start to address some of the questions that have already been submitted. And Jerry, we'll start with you. There were a couple of questions as you were getting started about some additional factors that might have an effect, and the first one is community safety. It says built environment components to increase physical activity are great, but the community has to feel like they can use them, they're culturally relevant, and that it's safe for them to use them. Was that something also that you were addressing?
That really, in terms of the guidelines we developed, that kind of first of all, absolutely, I agree. Without safety or a perception of safety, we could have all the most wonderful things in the world, right, that nobody would use. So that, in terms of our thinking about the guidelines and the design of the particular intervention school that our study addressed, was really taken into account in the community connectivity. In this particular case, our school was quite rural, and so very few kids were able to actually walk to school just because of sheer distance. So most kids in that case took the bus. I think, so I can't say that our study addressed safety of getting to school per se. I know that, in other areas, and certainly the Safe Routes to Schools program that's been national has made some progress in that regard. So I completely agree, safety is a huge issue, and it's essential if we want any interventions in the built environment to have a positive effect.
Great, thank you so much. And just quickly, one other environmentally related question. I know that school was in Virginia, but there was a question about families that struggle with access to wintertime gear to be able to be outside, boots, gloves, and jackets, for example. And so the question is about how weather and climate fit into this whole framework.
Yeah, so it does. And I would say, and I guess the designer side of me kind of kicks in here, that, given that we know that kids tend to be more active outside in those climates that aren't as conducive to being outside, and especially where we face issues of kids perhaps not being adequately equipped in terms of clothing and protection to be outside in harsh climates, are there ways design-wise that we can sort of bring the outside in? So we might think about large kind of fitness areas that have a lot of glazing or windows to where you can have sort of the impression of being outside and having that visual access to nature without actually being out in the cold. I don't know that that's really well studied yet, but certainly would be an interesting point to look at.
Great, thank you so much. And just a couple more questions for Jerry and then Kim, and then we'll have Joel coming back with some updates. So did you do any evaluation on learning outcomes? And the questions are getting moved around here, so folks. Did you have any evaluation on learning outcomes between the two schools and with changes in physical activity?
Unfortunately not. That was not within the scope of this particular study. I know that there is some literature out there that started to look at physical activity and learning outcomes with some positive, at least tentatively positive results, but we were not able to look at that in this particular study.
Okay, great. And is there any correlation with this project and nutrition provided at the schools?
Yes, there was. I didn't mention it here for lack of time, but we actually developed, in fact, it came a little bit sooner, a set of design guidelines focused on promoting healthy eating. And the portion of the school that was brand new construction actually included the kitchen, a brand new large commercial kitchen with ample storage for fresh fruits and vegetables, the cafeteria, or as we called it, the dining commons area, as well as actually a food lab and teaching kitchen, so as well as gardens. So there was a pretty concerted effort around healthy eating and education around, fresh foods and where they come from and what to do with them.
Oh, that's great. So, and one final question, the survey questions you used, somebody did point out that getting good data from third graders is pretty hard. Are those questions available somewhere?
So for the physical activity sedentary behavior study, we actually did not use survey questions at all. We put accelerometers on the kids, so little devices we had them wear on an elastic belt on the right hip bone so that we would get objective measures of movement over time. I believe for the healthy eating aspect of the study, my colleague Leah Frericks, who is now at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, she did use some surveying for that. And I would have to go back. I could check. I don't remember what source she used. It was a survey that someone else had developed, but I would have to follow up on that one.
Okay, thank you. And if we run out of time for questions, we will be posting answers later on. So if you do happen to think of that, we'll have a way to provide it to the group.
Great.
Thank you so much, Jerry. And I'm going to turn it over to Kim now. And a couple of people, Kim, were curious about how cafes is different from the smarter lunchrooms movement.
That's a great question. That work really informed a lot of the cafe's items. The Smarter Lunchrooms movement focuses a lot on the smaller 3 scales, so the furniture, the table, display scale, the plate or lunch tray scale, and the room scale. And they're also focused on making adjustments given the design of the cafeteria. So they weren't really looking as much at the interior design, which was my interest as an architect and a designer. So we were able to incorporate some of those larger factors from looking at, say, the study of restaurant design and some other relevant eating behavior literature and really extend it, and also aim to inform some design guidelines that speak to architects and designers of cafeterias. So although we're including suggestions like rearranging the lunch line so that healthy items appear first and fresh fruit appears at the checkout station, we're going to take that a step further and show how the lunch line can be designed to support or promote that in a cafeteria. We are also able to use this lunch tray photography to validate the cafe's tool. So we had a much larger sample of students and schools from various regions in the U.S. to look at that. I saw another question about cultural context, and so we did try to capture a lot of variability in the school environments, but unfortunately cultural relevance and food availability is not captured with cafes. We are hoping to make it possible to add items to the cafe's tool for people. Yeah, so we're building on the Smarter Lunchrooms movement, if that makes sense.
That does make a lot of sense, thank you. And there was also a comment that I'll just stick in here for feedback for you that the questioner said that they would be interested to see how these environmental factors align with the school wellness policies. I'm not sure whether that was included in your study.
We didn't look at that, but several schools contacted us about using cafes to identify different areas for improvement or that are working well to incorporate into their school wellness policies.
That's great. So another question, is performing a cafe score something any school or any school district can utilize, or is it a process that someone has to come and assess the cafeteria? And I know you were talking about that a little bit with the mobile app.
Yes. So anyone can download either the paper version or soon the mobile app and complete the CAFE score. The mobile app will have some instructions at the beginning of it, but I encourage anyone interested in using it to contact me for some preliminary instructions, as the paper version available with the publication does not have that information. But anyone can go through the process and conduct the scores and get the resulting list of interventions.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Kim. And we're just about out of time for questions for the two of you, Kim and Jerry. Again, if you continue to add questions to the queue, we will be able to respond to them online. But I did want to be able to turn it over to Joel for some updates. And please, as Joel is speaking, if you have questions for him, we can address those as well. So, Joel?
All right. Thank you, Eileen. And great presentation. It's good to hear all this. And I will just, as in a way of overview, as I work through this slide here, I'll say this is a very complex area, and it's how our total environment influences us. So as we adjust individual components of our environment, say the sounds or the lighting or the smells or the size of furniture and all these things, their additive or synergistic effects or negative effects on each other are going to be difficult to tease out. And there's also time effects, where when we get used to, say, the placement of foods in the cafeteria, the effective placement may have less effect on us. I mean, we all know kids reach behind the white milk to grab the chocolate milk once they learn where it is. So this is a complex area. So knowing this, as we worked with NCCOR and a variety of experts on developing behavioral design concepts out, we wrote a couple small business innovation research grants, which is a program that's out of the federal government where we fund small businesses to develop ideas out more that we have as feds, but that we don't really have the time or the ability to really get into the market. We think this is a very marketable idea. We know that the architect and design world is already engrossed in this area, but often doesn't really take the research database and apply it towards health outcomes like they might be able to. So we've awarded 2 of these grants to develop web-based applications to enable the use of sort of the research database on environmental change for health outcomes for these to be developed. Those have just started, and the initial products of those will be out in the next year. Those have the ability to have a second round of funding for further development, so we're very excited about that work. We've also just recently, and the announcement I think closed today actually, so I'm hoping some of the people on the phone actually applied for this. As you know, several applications are in, for a community-based worksite wellness app that links employees to wellness resources. And it's the kind of tool where we really want to be able to engage people in the way they think and the way they interact with a screen or an interface, and then with their community to overlap behavioral change on the way we experience, again, technology, our screens, information, and the physical information, the physical world in our communities, so sidewalks, buildings, other businesses, work sites. And then we also have used behavioral design. One of our first test cases for behavioral design was the development of Fitwell, which is now operated by the Center for Active Design up in New York City. And it's basically take a bunch of behavioral design ideas, how do we enable people to make better choices, healthier choices in the worksite environment, in buildings. And then we built a scorecard around that and said, okay, now if you do all these things as a building, you'll get Fitwell rated. As we were developing that, another company, they also released a similar type of rating system. But these systems are also very similar to the LEED system, to Green Globes, and other rating systems for either health outcomes, such as Fitwell or WELL, or environmental outcomes, such as LEED or Green Globes or others. And these all, if clever, you can work in these behavioral adjustments to facilitate people in making their choices. It really is about enabling people. And so the CDC continues to sort of partner and reach out to, again, divergent minds on how to do this. So we currently been working with the Department of Defense working with their cafeterias, redesigns, their micro markets, which they're doing a lot of, and that's sort of the placement, the lighting, the access, all these things. Starting to work with Veterans Affairs and with Georgia Tech. And Georgia Tech, of course, has sort of the classic design departments. But we're also working with a lot of their departments, their economics group and others that are, again, outside of this area. And one of the interesting areas that we've just started having discussions with, because CDC apparently has recently got into the virtual reality world. So virtual reality has now become really in the last couple of months, interestingly, has become sort of a more complex term than it once was. So you have XR, extended reality. Notably, Apple just named the latest iPhone XR, which is very clever marketing on their part. But you have MR, modified reality, AR, augmented reality. So this sort of adjusted reality, what the parent is called XR, is a real opportunity with a new NVIDIA card that has just come out, and we see this market really break open. So if you think about how do we model and use behavioral design, this is where it's going to begin to happen a lot. So I just sort of point everyone to sort of, I know if you've been following the tech world for 28 years, we've been hearing people say XR, 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 or AR, AR, and everyone's sort of like, whatever, it's not going to happen. It's going to happen now, so everyone keep their eyes open to that. And all the NCCOR partners are interested in this, and hopefully we'll continue to support research and movement. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joel. And NCCOR partners, including Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, at Health and Human Services, both NIH and CDC, and a number of the agencies at USDA as well. So there is interest across the NCCOR members, as Joel said. So if you have questions for Joel, please do include them here, or questions for NCCOR itself and the work that's going on. We invite you to add them here. And as I mentioned, since we won't have time to continue with those questions now, we would be able to post answers after in the next day or so. So just quickly, I'd like to mention a couple of upcoming events. There is another Connect and Explore webinar coming right up on November 6th. It's called America's Eating Habits, Food Away from Home. We'll highlight findings from USDA's Economic Research Service's new report. And Abigail Okrent and Michelle Saxena, both from USDA, will be presenting. I'm definitely looking forward to this new information, and I hope that you will join us as well. NCCOR will be at APHA. The session is called Tools of the Trade, NCCOR Resources for Evidence-Based Practice in Diet and Physical Activity. And it's November 13 at 3 p.m. The speakers will include Laura Kettle-Kahn from CDC, Jim Salas, UCSD, Jamie Kariki from University of Illinois Chicago, and Barbara Ainsworth from Arizona State. So we hope to see you there, and NCCOR also has a booth. If you have questions for NCCOR or would like to talk with members, that's a place for you. So again, do email us at ncor@fhi360.org if you have additional questions. Finally, some of you have asked if this is going to be accessible. Yes, indeed, it will. There's a really healthy number of viewings of these webinars after they happen, so we do encourage you to share this one in particular with your colleagues. To access the webinar, use the top navigation and click on Webinars. All the upcoming and archived webinars are displayed there. So again, thank you so much to our guest speakers, Joel, Jerry, and Kim, and to all of you who joined us this afternoon. Before signing off, just take a quick minute to complete our brief survey that will help us shape future webinars and maximize attendees' time. So we're going to switch over to the feedback form now, and you can write directly on the screen and hit submit. And have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you.